In the wilds of Wyoming in 1879, a lonely man living on a remote ranch wrote a simple letter seeking a wife by mail to share the work and the silence. He did not expect the reply to come from a woman with a torn past, a girl with sad eyes and scars she tried to hide under old sleeves. The day she stepped down from the carriage, the wind blew her straw hat, and in that moment, he saw something deeper than fear in her eyes, a soul seeking shelter. Then when he softly asked, "What have you been through?" she just kept silent. But the moment he saw those scars, everything in his heart changed. If it were you, would you be gentle enough to touch the pain of someone who was too afraid of love? Do you believe that there are wounds that don't need to be healed by words, but by a warm presence, by patience, by unconditional love? This is not just a story about a mail-order bride and a lonely man, but a journey to find faith, life, and kindness in the wild frontier. If you believe that true love can bloom even in the most broken of hearts, please like, share, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts, and join us on a journey where love conquers both fear and time. The morning in High Creek Basin began with a bitter chill. The wind from the Absaroka Mountains blew across the dry grass fields, whipping the face of a man as he quietly stepped out of the ash-gray cabin. Jonas Merrick tied his collar, clutched his thick, frayed coat, and scanned the white fields. In the distance, a few lean cows huddled together, their breath vaporizing in the morning mist. Jonas had lived alone here for almost 2 years, ever since his wife Sarah and their newborn son had died that winter. The town doctor had said they would not survive the fever. Jonas would never forget Sarah's last breath, soft as the wind against the window. After that, the house felt as empty as a deep well, and he himself found himself falling to the bottom with no way back up. Jonas's days were a replica of the previous ones. He rose early, lit the fire, fed the horses, and went out to check the fences. With no one else to talk to, he talked to the sky, the earth, and sometimes to himself. When the wind was strong, he thought he could hear Sarah calling out through the snow, but it was only the wind through the loose boards of the barn roof. In the evenings, Jonas would sit by the fire, holding a rusted silver ring in his hand. He would turn it between his fingers until the firelight reflected off the cold metal. In the flickering light, the ring still seemed to be warm from Sarah's hand. But when he closed his hand, all he felt was calloused, hard skin. Some nights, he would lay the ring on the table and stare at it for hours, as if he looked long enough, the person in his memory might return. Jonas rarely went into town. He was afraid to hear people laughing, afraid to meet someone's pitying eyes. The last time he went to the grocery store, the storekeeper asked, "Is your farm all right, Jonas?" He simply replied, "It's still standing." And that was it. The words seemed to describe his whole life still standing, but not alive. Some afternoons, when the last light of day fell through the hedges, Jonas would stop hoeing and look at the distant hill. There, stuck in the snow, were 2 small wooden boards where he had buried Sarah and their son. He had carved their names into the wood with a knife, but the long winter had blurred the writing. Sometimes he thought of recarving, but then he stopped, fearing that doing so would bring back the pain. He did not cry, not because he did not want to, but because his tears had dried up along with his faith. There were nights when the blizzards blew through and Jonas lay listening to the wind, feeling guilty that he was still breathing. If God wants to keep someone, he thought, why not them in his rare dreams? He saw Sarah holding the baby in a summer meadow, her hair blowing in the wind. He ran towards her, But the faster he walked, the farther he was. When he was almost there, the image faded, leaving only the rustling of the grass and an empty space that stretched into infinity. During the day, Jonas escaped these memories with work. He hammered stakes, sawed wood, dug wells. Each swing of the hammer, each cut was a form of self-punishment, trying to tire himself out so much that he could no longer think. His hands were cracked and bloody, but he did not care. "As long as the camp stands, I must work," he said to himself. One December afternoon, the wind changed direction. Dark clouds rolled in from the north, blanketing the sky. Jonas knew a snowstorm was coming. He ran to gather wood, tied the stable door, and returned home before the first snowflake fell. He lit a fire in the narrow cabin, the warmth spreading slowly, the silver ring lying on the table again, reflecting a warm orange light. Jonas looked at it for a long time, then suddenly said softly, to whom it was not clear, "I'm sorry." The words vanished into thin air, unheard, but they seemed to lift a weight from his chest. For the first time in months, Jonas felt like he was living in the present, not in the tomb of memories. Night fell. The storm blew through. The wind howled outside the window, like the howling of lost souls. Jonas sat back in his chair, watching the fire, thinking of the winter before, the winter that had taken everything. He didn't know if he would survive this one, but somewhere inside him, a small spark of will still burned. The next day the sky cleared. Thick snow covered the fields, shining in the sun. Jonas put on his coat, the snow crunching under his feet. He stopped in front of the stable, put his hand on the old horse's mane. "We're still here, aren't we?" "Duke." The animal snorted, sneezed, its breath steaming. Jonas smiled slightly. The first smile in months. On the porch, a snowflake fell into his palm. It melted quickly, leaving behind a small drop of water. Jonas looked at the drop and suddenly thought of Sarah, of the child who had not yet grown up, and of himself, who had not yet let go of his pain. In the silence of the meadow, he suddenly realized silence was not only loneliness, but also the way the world was listening to him. And perhaps, in that silence, something small but persistent is beginning to change. That winter lasted longer than usual, and in each white day, Jonas gradually learned to listen to the silence of the plains, a silence that did not kill him, but taught him to find the breath of life again. The snow lay thick on the ground, hardening into crisp flakes underfoot. Every morning, as the faint light of dawn touched the stable roof, Jonas Merrick would go outside, his breath turning to smoke. The field was no longer a field, it was a vast white sea, and he was alone in it. The old horse, Duke, was his only companion. Jonas had spoken to him more than to anyone else in nearly a year. "It's colder than last year." "Huh," he said hoarsely, echoing in the empty air. Duke sniffed and sneezed, shaking his big head slightly, making the reins jingle. The sound, in the vast snowfield, sounded like the last fragile pulse of life, day after day. Jonas went around the fence, checking the hay, cleaning the frozen gutters. He waited for no one, and he sent no letters. The town was 30 miles away, and the winter had almost buried the roads. But sometimes, while he was gathering firewood or clearing snow from the roof, he would look up at the horizon, where the snow and clouds mingled. There, he thought, was still the world of men. One afternoon, he stopped by the well and listened to the sound of the wind passing through the cracks in the rocks. The sound was long and piercing, but there was a strange rhythm to it, slow, steady, like the breathing of the earth. He wasn't sure if he was hearing it or imagining it, But the more he listened, the slower and less chaotic his heartbeat became. Silence, he thought, is not really empty. It is just waiting for me to respond. But in response to what, Jonas did not know. The night was cold in the cabin. The fire crackled in the stove. He sat there, wrapped in his blanket, watching the flames dance. Sometimes he spoke just to hear himself again. His voice was hoarse, dry as burnt wood. "It'll be sunny tomorrow, Duke," he said, though he didn't know why. Then he smiled an unseen smile, tired and gentle. January passed slowly, as if the weather had forgotten to change seasons. The wind blew relentlessly, and the snow continued to fall. One morning, Jonas woke up to find the barn door half buried. He had to dig his way out, sweat soaking his shirt, his breath billowing thick smoke. When he was done, he sat down, his hands shaking from cold and exhaustion. But at that moment, he realized something very small. He still wanted to live. Not for any great reason. Just because Duke was waiting to be fed. Because the cows needed to be led out of the deep snow. Because if the fire in the hearth died out, the house would be nothing but cold wood. These small things, ordinary and repetitive, suddenly became the thin thread that connected him to the world. One afternoon, the wind had stopped. Jonas led the horse out into the fields, the reins clicking softly like breathing. He rode Duke along the hillside, the wind blowing in his face, cold but clear. In the open air, he felt small, yet at the same time as if he were melting into the earth and sky. He said softly, "I'm still here, Duke." Both of us. The sound echoed out, faint, then disappeared into the void. But the silence that followed was no longer frightening. It was like someone's palm, giant and gentle, was supporting the sky. The next day the sun came out, a pale yellow light spreading across the prairie. Jonas sat on the porch, adjusting the saddle, listening to the dripping of ice from the roof. The sound reminded him of spring, something he thought he could never wait for. In the little hut, he began to clean. The cot was made, the table wiped, and for the first time in months Jonas opened the window. A cold wind rushed in, carrying the scent of hay and dusting snow. But instead of closing it, he let the wind blow through, blowing away the musty smell. One evening, he took Sarah's old mandolin out of its case. The strings were rusty, the tone unsteady, but he plucked a few notes anyway. The music rang out faintly, breaking in the air, then fading on the wind. Clumsy as it was the first sound in the house in a long time, not fire, not breathing. It was human. It was alive. Jonas paused, his eyes fixed on the dark window. For a moment he imagined Sarah standing on the porch, her cloak covered with snow, her smile as gentle as ever. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and said softly, "I'm still here, Sarah, but I'm learning to listen." Outside, the wind blew harder, stirring the snow from the roof. There was a whisper in the sound. It might have been imaginary, but to Jonas, it was an answer from the earth, from the sky, from his own heart. The day passed. The ground dried. The cows began to search for fresh grass. The first flock of geese flew southward in the sky, tracing a bold V in the sunlight. Jonas looked up, his hand covering his forehead. A strange feeling washed over him, not joy, not exactly hope, but relief that he still belonged. He turned back, placing his hand on the horse's neck. "We'll be fine. Duke," he whispered, "everything will move again." And in that silence, he believed it was true. When the last snow melted, Jonas began to hear more of the wind, sometimes the distant sound of carriage wheels, sometimes the postman calling someone's name. He had never expected that. In the middle of spring, a slender letter would change everything. Spring came slowly, as if the earth and sky hesitated after the long winter. The snowmelt trickled down the hillside in thin streams, murmuring in the dim light. Jonas Merrick stood on the porch, listening to the sound and feeling as if he could hear his own heart beating again quietly, slowly, but real. All winter he had lived on silence, but now, as the first birds of the season sang from the willows, the silence began to make him feel empty. There was no one to talk to, no one to ask, "How was your day?" And that was what suddenly frightened him. Afraid that one day my voice will disappear with the wind. That afternoon, when the postman stopped his horse at the gate, Jonas was just going to pick up some bills. But the thin man with the dusty hat asked, "Would you like to advertise for helpers on the farm? The Frontier Post is taking applications this week." Jonas looked at the crumpled newspaper in his hand. The thought flashed through his mind like a faint light. Not a hired hand, he thought, but a companion. That night, in a room lit only by yellow candlelight, Jonas sat down at the table. A blank sheet of paper lay before him, and his pen trembled in his hand. It had been a long time since he had written. The first word was slanted, the next hurried, but he continued writing, as if he stopped, his courage would fail him. He wrote, "Looking for a wife, not for loneliness, but to share the work and the long seasons in the prairie. I have a small farm, warm enough in winter, large enough to plant flowers in spring. I am not young, nor rich, but I am honest. If anyone needs a home more than a dream, please write to me." As he signed, Jonas paused. His name, Jonas Merrick, seemed strange to him. Part of him, the man who had buried his wife and child, did not believe he had the right to hope. But the other part, the part that lived on candlelight and melted snow, whispered maybe. Just try it once. He folded the letter, put it in an envelope, and sealed it with red wax. When the postman returned, Jonas handed it to him, his hand still shaking. The postman smiled and asked, "Who is it?" For Jonas simply replied, in a low voice, "For someone who can hear me." 2 weeks later, on a misty morning, Jonas received a reply. The letter was thin, the yellow envelope frayed at the edges, and the handwriting was feminine, neat and restrained. In the upper left corner was the sender's name, Lillian Graves, St. Joseph, Missouri. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he sat on the porch steps and looked at the piece of paper as if it were something fragile. He felt a strange mixture of fear, hope, and disbelief. Finally, he opened the letter. Inside, there are just a few lines. "Dear Mr. Merrick, I read your letter in the paper, and my heart stopped at those words. I have lost many things, more than a woman should lose. I am not looking for love, but for a peaceful place to work, cook, and not be afraid. If that suits you, please write back. Lillian Graves." No flowery words, no warm greetings, but each word carried the breath of someone trying to keep from breaking. Jonas read it over and over again, feeling something in his chest stretch an old wound, perhaps slowly healing. He placed the letter by the candlelight. The flame reflected off the stranger's trembling handwriting, making it seem alive. In that moment, he saw more than a woman. He saw himself, all the years of fear, silence, and still longing to trust again. A man who has lost more than one woman should lose. He repeated the sentence like a sad prayer. Jonas did not sleep that night. He sat by the window, watching the silver moonlight spread over the fields. Each time the wind blew, the letter trembled, making a small sound, like a distant whisper. He imagined the face of the woman who had written it. Nothing but the quiet eyes, the trembling of her hand on the paper. The next morning, Jonas took out a new sheet of paper. Writing a reply was not easy, not because he did not know what to say, but because he was afraid of saying too much. In the end, he simply wrote Miss Graves, "Thank you for writing to me. I am not looking for love, just peace. The winters here are harsh, but the land is gentle. If you want to start over, I will pick you up when spring comes full circle." He signed it, folded it carefully, and handed it to the postman the following week. When the envelope disappeared behind the postman, Jonas stood and stared at it for a long time, as if it were a piece of his own soul being sent inside. The days passed. The wind grew warmer. The snow melted. Jonas worked as usual, but something was different. Every evening he went out on the porch and looked east to the road leading to town, where, perhaps, a stranger was preparing to set out. And then, one morning in early May, as the first daisies were blooming along the edge of the fence, Jonas heard a carriage stop at the gate. In his hand, the silver ring was cold, but his heart was strangely warm. The road leading to Helena Station was covered with a thin layer of dust. The pale yellow morning sunlight filtered through the mist. The sound of the wheels grinding on the gravel mingled with the sound of the horses breathing heavily after the long journey. The carriage station was nestled in the middle of the valley, a row of low wooden houses with steep roofs, chimneys belching blue smoke into the clear sky. Lillian Graves stepped down from the gray carriage, slowly, as if she could not believe the ground beneath her feet was real. She held tightly to her small suitcase, the only possession she had left after years of running. Her dark brown flannel coat was covered in road dust, its sleeves frayed. And when she bent down to pick up the suitcase, a faint scar appeared on her wrist, old but deep, like an indelible memory. No one noticed, except a newspaper boy who glanced at her and then looked away. But Lillian still withdrew her hand, quickly hiding it under her sleeve. It seemed she was afraid that even a casual glance would reveal her. The air from the carriage smelled of smoke, horsehide, and the clamor of people calling to each other. She stood still for a moment, her eyes fixed on the rolling hills in the distance, where the man in the letter might be waiting. A gentle breeze blew, making the brim of her hat quiver. Beneath it were deep, frightened eyes, like those of a bird that had just escaped a trap. "Mrs. Graves." A man's voice rang out, low and hesitant. Lillian turned. The man stood a few steps away, tall and thin, wearing an old leather jacket and dusty shoes. His face was tanned, with deep lines at the corners of his eye traces of years of exposure to wind and snow. But his gaze was quiet, unscrutinizing, filled with a reserved gentleness. "I am Jonas Merrick." She nodded slightly, not speaking. His voice was warm but hoarse, as if it had not been used for a long time. Jonas stepped forward, intending to take the suitcase from her hand. When his fingers touched hers, Lillian jerked back, her breath catching in her throat. Jonas stopped short, his hand still hovering in the air. "It's okay," he said softly. "I just want to help." Lillian nodded, but her eyes remained averted, staring at the ground, as if she were holding back something. A second later, she handed him the suitcase herself. The action was small, but enough for Jonas to understand she was fighting her own fear. The two of them walked out to the carriage yard. The wind blew through the yard, carrying with it the jingling of horse bells. Jonas tied his luggage to the carriage and opened the door for her. Lillian stepped in, her slender figure sitting close to the wooden frame, her hands clasped in her lap. When Jonas got into the carriage, the distance between them was only a hand's breadth, but their inner worlds were as far apart as two frozen rivers. The carriage moved. The wheels crunched on gravel. The faint jingle of the reins, that was the only sound between the two strangers. Jonas glanced at her. She sat still, her eyes staring straight ahead, her lips pressed together. With each jolt, her hands clenched tighter, her fingers turning white. Jonas wanted to say something, but he had no idea where to begin. He was not used to talking much. Living alone made words a luxury. Finally, he said in a low voice, "It's a long way to the camp, but you'll be all right." Lillian turned her head, her eyes strange. She nodded slightly, then looked out the window. Outside, the field stretched endlessly, shimmering in the sunlight. Bluish-green mountains on the horizon, a few birds flying by. Beautiful, but desolate, like her heart at that moment, both afraid and longing for peace. After a while, Jonas added, "It's windy here, but the soil is rich. They say Wyoming is harsh, but if you're patient, it will give you what you need." She did not answer. Only the wind blowing through the carriage lifted a lock of hair from under the brim of her hat, and Jonas involuntarily looked at it. The light touched the copper hair, making it sparkle against the sky. He turned away quickly, afraid he had looked too long. The road grew more deserted. Past the narrow stream, there was only the sound of the wind whistling through the grassy hills. Jonas cleared his throat and said, almost in a whisper, "You needn't be afraid there. I just wish someone to talk to during the long days." Lillian turned, looking at him carefully for the first time. Her eyes were no longer frightened, but searching as if she wanted to know if the man meant what he said. Jonas did not avoid her gaze. He let those eyes examine him, like a silent judgment. "Finally," Lillian said softly, "I will try." The car continued on, rolling across the vast plains. The sun was low, its light falling on the hillsides. In that moment, in the golden space, two lonely people, one guilty, one fearful, were slowly moving towards the same place, a roof, unfamiliar, but perhaps a place to start over. It was getting late when they left Helena Station. On the way back to the farm, silence was the only language left, a silence as tense as reins in hand, where every look, every breath was filled with things left unsaid. The sun had already set low behind the hills, leaving a faint orange streak in the sky, tinged with pale purple. The carriage rolled steadily on the red dirt road, the wheels crunching over the gravel. At each turn, the wind blew a fine layer of dust, covering the two people's shoulders like a thin veil of memory. Jonas Merrick held the reins, his eyes looking straight ahead, his face calm, but his teeth clenched slightly. He had never felt so clumsy in his life. Every time he tried to say something, his throat felt dry, as if the wind had taken all the breath out of him. The woman sitting next to him, Lillian Graves, remained silent. She sat close to the outside, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes on the horizon, where dark clouds were gathering as if preparing for the night wind. Jonas glanced at her now and then. Each glance was brief, but long enough to notice the weariness in Lillian's posture. There was something about her that reminded him of lost birds, thin, frail, but still taking flight because there was no other way. As the road began to rise, Jonas stopped the cart. He turned and said in a hoarse, almost whispering voice, "There are sand dunes ahead, and the cart will not be able to go. From here, we will ride back to camp." Lillian nodded and slowly dismounted. Her shoes sank lightly into the sand, and dust clung to the hem of her skirt. Jonas tied the horse and held out his hand, intending to help her into the saddle. She looked at the hand. It was tanned, rough, scarred from work, and hesitated. For a moment, instinctive fear flashed in her eyes. She took a half-step back. Jonas immediately withdrew his hand, his voice softening. "It's okay. You can get up by yourself." He turned away, avoiding her gaze, and went to retie the reins, trying to act as if nothing had happened. But there was a small scratch in his heart, not because of the rejection, but because he understood the reason for her reticence. He had seen that look on many a wounded wild animal, the look of one accustomed to being hunted. Lillian took a deep breath and held herself up on the saddle. She swayed slightly. Her skirts caught in the stirrups. Jonas hurried over and put his hand on the saddle behind her, not touching her, just to keep his balance. He said, softly, as if he were swearing to the wind, "You're safe here." Lillian paused. Only 4 short words, but his voice was so deep and sincere that she had to lift her head. Jonas's face was tanned in the sunset, and his ashen eyes lit up for a moment. Not the look of someone who wanted pity, but the look of someone who had lost and knew what it was to be afraid. She nodded slightly, then turned away. Jonas mounted the horse, sat in front, holding the reins. The horse moved forward, the wind blowing her skirts, her hair fluttering against his shoulder. They were close enough to hear each other breathing, but their hearts were still a world apart. It was getting dark. The sand dunes opened up before him, vast and silent as the sea. There was only the sound of horse hooves and the slight trembling of the reins in the wind. Jonas felt a warmth at his back, light and fragile as the last rays of sunlight. He did not turn around, but said softly, "This road is long, but at the end you will see the plain. There, my camp is near a stream." Lillian didn't answer. She looked around, the scenery changing color with the rising moon. The night breeze carried the scent of dry grass, pine, and damp earth, a scent of life. She realized she had been gripping the saddle for too long, so she relaxed and took a deep breath. Behind Jonas, she heard his breathing low, even like the breathing of someone learning to calm down. For a moment, Lillian found herself not so afraid anymore. For the rest of the journey, they hardly spoke, but the silence was no longer a barrier, but a thin blanket wrapped around the two of them, a silent companionship. When they crossed the last hill, the moon was high in the sky. Silver light fell on the wide prairie, reflecting off the wooden fence in the distance. Jonas pulled on the reins and pointed. "Callaway Ranch. That's my house." "Oh, our house, if you want it." She followed his gaze. In the middle of the meadow was a small wooden house, thin smoke rising into the sky. The firelight in the window cast a warm yellow light, like a greeting to a new world. Lillian swallowed. A strange yet familiar feeling spread through her, half fear, half hope. She said softly, her voice trembling slightly, "I don't know if I deserve a place like this." "No one has to deserve peace," Jonas replied, without turning. "One only has to want it." The words fell on the wind, mingling with the slight sway of the reins. And for a moment, Lillian felt something melt in her chest, the place that had been frozen with fear. That night, they stopped on the porch, the fire still burning in the kitchen. Neither of them said much. There was only the sound of spoons hitting wooden bowls, and shy glances exchanged at a distance close enough to hear one's heart beat. Jonas Merrick's cabin sat in the middle of the prairie, small and quiet enough to hear the wind through the planks. When Lillian Graves entered, she paused. It wasn't that the house was ugly. It was that it smelled of people-burnt wood, dry horsehide, and a hint of old, minty soap. She had never been in a place that made her feel so safe and yet so scared. Jonas went ahead and put the suitcase down by the fire. He said only one sentence. "You can sleep in the back room. The bed is small, but the blankets are warm." Lillian nodded. She wasn't used to hearing thank you, but as she touched the folded quilt, she knew the man had prepared it days in advance. The next morning, the sun shone through the window, casting a golden glow on the dining table. Lillian got up early, as was her habit. She lit the stove, cooked a pot of cornmeal porridge, and fried some bacon. The aroma spread throughout the house. Jonas woke up to the smell of food, quietly walked out, and stood at the window watching. She didn't notice him watching her. She just bent her head and worked, her figure lean but steady. Her every movement was light, slow, careful, as if afraid to break the silence. Jonas wanted to say something. "Let me help," or simply, "It looks delicious," but the words died in his throat before they could come out. He sat down in his chair, silent. The first meal passed in silence. The wooden spoons clinked against the porcelain bowls, soft but clear. The wind blew through the windows, making the curtains sway slightly. They both ate slowly, neither daring to look at the other for too long. Only when Lillian stood up to wash the dishes did Jonas say softly, "Thank you. For breakfast?" Lillian looked up, the light falling over her shoulder, making her eyes sparkle with surprise. "It's what I should do," she replied, her voice low, almost a whisper. But as she turned away, her lips pursed slightly, a strange feeling slowly blossoming in her heart, the feeling of being needed. 1. As the days passed, they worked together, but kept their distance, like two people walking side by side. Jonas went to the fields to check the fence. Lillian swept, mended the curtains, washed the old coats. When he returned, she had lit the stove and left the hot water ready. He wanted to say thank you again, but the look in her eyes stopped him. Not because he was afraid, but because she looked like someone learning to believe in peace again. To say too much would make her close herself off. In the evening, they sat at opposite ends of the long table. The firelight bounced off the wall, casting silent shadows. Jonas glanced at her occasionally, saw her slender hands sewing his collar. The needle flickered and then died, like a star passing through the night. He suddenly remembered the old days, when Sarah, his dead wife, had sat in the same place, working just as hard. But this time, the memory didn't hurt. It just made him breathe more slowly, as if to avoid breaking the moment. She put her shirt down on the table. "I found the chicken coop leaking. I'll fix it tomorrow." He was a little startled, then smiled. "I'll help. It's very windy here." She nodded, not looking at him, but between them. The silence was no longer as heavy as it had been in the morning. It became a comfortable space, where unsaid things could grow without words. So, a week passed. Things began to find their own rhythm. Lillian cooked, did the laundry, tended the small vegetable garden behind the house. Jonas worked outside the camp, sometimes coming home early to help her carry firewood. No orders were given, no promises were made, but they understood each other's role, as two fellow survivors. One afternoon, it began to rain. Jonas brought his horse home, drenched. When he entered, he found her busy preparing dinner. Her hair was down, a few wet strands sticking to her neck, and her face was beaded with sweat. He stood in the doorway, saying nothing, just looking, longer than usual. Lillian noticed, turned, and met his eyes. They were both silent. The rain outside was falling steadily, the patter of it harmonizing with the rhythm of breathing. Jonas nodded slightly, a smile flickering like firelight on wood. She bent down and said softly, "You can sit down. I'm almost done." It was the first time she called him by his name, just one word, but it warmed the house a few degrees. That night at dinner, they were still sitting far apart, but the firelight in the middle of the table had changed color more golden, softer. When Jonas reached for more cornbread, lightly touching the wooden spoon she was holding, Lillian flinched, but she didn't pull away, just set the spoon down gently, her eyes still. Neither of them said anything, but they both knew the distance had narrowed a little, not in words, but in presence. Outside, the rain fell slowly. In the small house, two people ate dinner quietly by the firelight. The sound of spoons, breathing, and the wind blended into a gentle melody, the music of the beginning. At night, Lillian sat near the window, her eyes fixed on the darkness outside. Although the fire in the stove was still burning, she still kept the habit of sitting near the exit, as if afraid that a gust of wind from the past could rush in at any moment. The night air in High Creek Basin smelled of damp pasture, with hints of pine resin and wood smoke. Inside the cabin, the firelight from the fireplace was warm and yellow, but not enough to dispel the chill of memory. Lillian Graves sat by the door, her hand lightly touching the wooden frame, her eyes fixed on the outside, where there was only darkness and the sound of wind. Every night since she had arrived at the farm, she had sat there, not to watch the moon, but to keep watch. The door was, to her, both an escape route and a thin line between safety and danger. Jonas did not ask. He knew that there were some things one should not touch until one was ready to talk. He just quietly worked around the house chopping wood, mending water tanks, adjusting window hinges. Occasionally, he would glance at her, seeing the light from the fireplace paint her face in delicate shadows and light, her eyes always searching for something out there, a sign, a shadow, or simply true silence. Jonas began to notice the little things. She never turned her back on anyone, whether at the table or while washing dishes. She always chose a spot where she could see the door. When working in the yard, she would stand at an angle so that her eyes could scan the gate. Even when hanging blankets to dry, her eyes would unconsciously wander to the dirt road leading to town, a place few people used. One evening, when he brought water from the well, Lillian was startled. The mere sound of the door opening made her take a half-step back. Still holding the wooden ladle like a weapon, Jonas stopped and said softly, "It was me." She exhaled, her eyes drooping, her lips trembling slightly. "Sorry, I didn't mean to." He put down the bucket of water and nodded. "It's okay. Sometimes the wind is strong here. The door makes a loud noise, and it can easily startle people." He said that to lighten the mood, but inside, a pang of sadness welled up. That woman lived like a small animal that had just escaped a trap, always ready to run away even if no one was chasing her. A few days later, it was raining. The wind whistled around the roof. Jonas sat mending the saddle, while Lillian quietly sewed the old curtain. The sound of the needle cutting through the fabric mingled with the sound of the rain on the roof, steady and sad. Jonas wanted to say something, to fill the space between them, but he knew silence would be kinder than words. He just watched her not as a man watches a woman, but as one who listens to a soul finding its breath. After a moment, Lillian raised her head. "You never ask me anything." Her voice was small, but it echoed in the quiet house. Jonas looked up, his ashen eyes meeting hers. "I thought you would tell me when the time came." She was silent for a moment, then bent down and continued sewing. Her fingers trembled slightly. The stitches were a little off. She smiled slightly, a smile as thin as smoke. "Maybe. I've forgotten what it means to be on time." Jonas did not answer. He only nodded and continued with his saddle. But from that night on, he knew that something was slowly cracking in her silent shell. A small crack, but real. The next day, the sky cleared. Lillian went out to dry her blankets, the sun shining on her hair, the golden light mingling with the dust. Jonas looked out the window and saw the scene, and his heart softened. The light surrounded her like a thin protective layer, and he thought perhaps nature was helping her to recover too. In the afternoon, he brought her a cup of hot tea. When he handed it to her, he put the cup down on the table, not forcing her to accept it. "Time tea," he said. "It will help you sleep." She looked at the cup and nodded slightly, but instead of drinking, she put her hand on the edge of the table, where the light from the window made a warm glow. "I can't sleep near the window," she said. "I'm afraid." The sentence stopped. She didn't say what she was afraid of. Jonas just replied, as light as a breath, "You can lock the door. No one can get in here except the wind." Their eyes met, briefly, but for a moment. Her fear seemed to be soothed by his gaze. "Hos, maybe." That night, Jonas went out to the stables. The sky was clear. The wind was still, and there was only the sound of crickets and the rustling of the earth. When he returned, the lights in the house were still on. Through the window, Lillian was still sitting by the door, small, staring into the distance. The firelight illuminated her face half light, half dark, like a soul caught between two worlds, the past and the future. Jonas stood there for a long time, not wanting to scare her, nor wanting to leave. He understood that some wounds only heal when someone watches silently from the outside, so the person inside can breathe peacefully. The next morning, Lillian stepped out onto the porch. She found his coat hanging, dry and folded. Next to it was a cup of cold tea, streaked with dew. She knew he had been standing guard out here all night. She said nothing. She just gently touched the glass. The cold seeped into her fingertips, but her heart felt strangely warm. The days passed in brief peace, until one early winter morning, the sound of chicken wings beating loudly on the porch made Lillian stand still, and the past, which had seemed to be asleep, suddenly rose in a snow-white panic. Winter came early in High Creek Basin. A heavy snowfall had fallen overnight. blanketing the farmyard and fences. In the morning, the first light shone through the windows, reflecting off the thick layer of snow so brightly that it seemed as if the world had been bleached white. Lillian Graves opened the kitchen door and a cold air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of iron and burning wood. She wrapped a scarf around her neck and prepared to go to the hen house to get the eggs. The air was dead silent, except for the crunch of snow underfoot. Everything seemed normal until a rooster, blown open by the wind, flapped its wings wildly, the sound echoing in the empty space. That sound, to others, it was just a familiar noise, but to her, it tore through the air like a knife. For a moment, her breath caught. Lillian froze in the middle of the yard. Her eyes widened, her pupils contracted, staring blankly. Her breathing quickened, then disappeared. She let go of the basket of eggs, which fell to the snow and shattered. Memories flooded back, indistinct, just the sound of the fan, the sound of the door locking, the heavy footsteps behind her. She was no longer in Wyoming, but drifting back to a damp room in New Orleans. The smell of alcohol, the smell of cigarettes, and someone's hand squeezing her wrist. She stepped back, barefoot, not knowing when she had taken off her sandals. Each backward step felt like stepping on a cold knife. The snow was ankle deep, but she felt nothing. Jonas, who was in the stables, heard a strange noise. He looked up and saw her, small in the snow, her hands trembling, her breathing quick, her eyes no longer seeing him. He threw down his tools and ran back. Lillian. No response. She stood still, her body shaking from time to time. He stopped a few steps away from her, afraid to frighten her further. His voice was low and restrained. Lillian, look at me. No answer, just the wind whistling through the fence, blowing her hair, revealing the old scar on her neck. He slowed down, step by step. Then, when they were only an arm's length apart, he embraced her, not squeezing, not forcing, just holding. She struggled slightly, trying to escape, but he still held her, patiently, like someone holding a frightened bird. He lowered his head, his voice breaking in cold breaths. Listen to me. You're not broken, just injured. Those words, you're not broken, just wounded, fell into the air, dissolving with their breaths. But when the wind blew, it seemed to be held by the snow itself, silently covering the two shivering bodies. She was silent. Then she bent slightly, resting her head on his shoulder. Her body still trembled, but she no longer resisted. Her tears soaked into his coat, then froze in the cold. Jonas said nothing more. He just stood there, in the white snow, holding her as if she were a small creature, pulled from the abyss. Finally, the trembling subsided. Her breathing returned, short, hoarse, but real. Jonas bent down and whispered in her ear, "Take a deep breath. I'm here." She did so with difficulty, but each breath followed another. Each breath was a thin thread pulling her back to reality. When she opened her eyes, the snow was still falling, but the world was quiet. She saw Jonas's face. His eyes were worried, but there was no pity, only something warm and steady, like a fire in the night. She whispered hoarsely, "I am sorry." Jonas shook his head. "No need. It is no one's fault for being afraid." He took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. They stood like that for a while, in the wind. Neither of them said anything, but they both knew something had just changed forever. That afternoon, when they returned home, Lillian sat silently by the stove. Jonas made her a cup of hot tea. She held it in both hands, not drinking it, just smelling it. "I thought I would never be afraid again," she said softly. "But it turns out the past still finds its way." Jonas sat opposite, the firelight illuminating half his face. "I know," he said, "but you faced it. You didn't run away. That's enough." She looked at him, not avoiding his gaze for the first time. The firelight reflected in her eyes, making them sparkle, not with tears, but with a glimmer of hope that had just sprung up amidst the ashes of fear. That night, when Jonas went out to check the stables, he stopped in the middle of the yard and looked up at the sky. The snow was still falling, each flake as slowly as time melting into the ground. In the house behind him, the light was still on. Inside, he knew, was a man who was just beginning to believe. A few days later, as the snow melted, Lillian sat by the fire and said she needed to tell everything because she wanted pity, but because it was time to stop being afraid. "Nana, no." The snow outside began to melt, slowly and wetly. A thin stream of water trickled down the steps, leaving transparent streaks on the brown ground. Inside, the fireplace still burned, its small flames reflecting off the old wooden walls, making the room seem warmer than usual. Lillian Graves sat in a chair, her hands clasped together, her eyes on the fire. The flames danced as if to illuminate the memories she had always avoided. Jonas sat a few feet away, silent, not urging, not asking. He just listened, with the respect of someone who knows what it means to be pain that is not touched. After a long moment, her voice rang out small, hoarse, and trembling like old paper in the wind. "I want to tell you about me. If I don't, I will live in fear forever." Jonas nodded slightly, his eyes resting on her hands, slender fingers clasped together, white. "When I was 17, she began, "I lived in Kansas City with my parents. We were poor, but happy. One afternoon, as I was coming home from the bakery, a car stopped on the side of the road. They said they needed help carrying groceries. I believed they." Her voice trailed off. The room seemed frozen. Only the crackling of the firewood could be heard. "I never went home. They drugged me. And when I woke up, I was in a strange place. They said I was sold. I didn't understand what that meant until it was too late." She was silent. Her breathing was heavy, her shoulders shaking slightly. Jonas still said nothing. He just stood slowly, added more wood to the fire, letting the firelight shine a little brighter, as if to let her continue talking without having to see the darkness. "That place was New Orleans," she continued, her voice choking. "A big house, yellow lights, people laughing all night long. I thought I was dead, but every morning I woke up. I was still alive, just not myself anymore." The first tear fell, rolling down my cheek, glistening in the firelight. I don't know how long I was there. A year. 2 years. I lost track of time. I escaped once, but I was caught. They beat me and left this scar. She raised her hand to her left wrist, where the faint scar she had hidden all her life lay. Then one night, there was a fire. I ran out in my torn clothes and boarded a ship. I headed north. No one asked who I was, and no one wanted to know. I changed my name, worked at an inn, and then happened to see an advertisement. She looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "Yours." Jonas took a deep breath. He remembered clearly the words he had written, that night of the first snowfall, seeking a wife for companionship and work partnership. At the time, he had only thought of filling the void in the house, but now he understood the letter she had sent back had saved them both. Lillian bowed her head, her voice low. "I was afraid that if you knew, you would despise me. I am no longer a real woman. I am not—" The sentence broke off mid-sentence, caught in her throat. She covered her face, tears welling up. Jonas approached, slowly, unhurriedly. He knelt before her, his hands not touching, just at eye level. He spoke softly, his voice low and firm. "Lillian, you are not what people make you out to be. You are a survivor." She shook her head, tears falling onto the hem of her dress. "I am dirty. I am ashamed." Jonas interrupted, softly but firmly. "No. You deserve respect, because you kept your humanity, even though people wanted to take it away." The firelight reflected off her face, wet with tears, but strangely bright. Jonas reached out and touched the back of her hand. She flinched, but didn't pull away. He just squeezed it, just enough to say he was there, that she didn't have to carry it alone. There was a long silence. The sound of the wind outside gradually died down. At last she said, her voice trembling and softer, "I never thought anyone would listen to me without disgust." Jonas answered softly, "There are things that need no forgiveness, because you have never done anything wrong." She looked up, her eyes red, mixed with the light of the fire. Amidst the tears, there was a small ray of light, the light of faith, reviving. After she finished, they sat in silence for a long time. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. A thin warmth spread through the house, as if the story itself, painful as it was, had freed her soul from the invisible bond that had held it so tightly. Jonas looked at her silently. He didn't say it's okay. He didn't say I understand. He was just there, quiet, like a flame, not too bright, but never extinguished. Night fell. When Jonas went outside, the sky was clear. He looked up at the starry sky, the sky she had said she had never dared to look up at. A quiet thought crossed his mind. Perhaps one's past cannot be erased, but if one is gentle enough, one can write a sequel. Inside. Lillian sat before the fireplace, the flames casting a golden glow on her face. She wiped her eyes, took a deep breath, and smiled for the first time, a tired but real smile. From that night on, she no longer ran away from her name. But the darkness did not let her go. It still followed her, in every dream, in every time the light shone on the scar. Spring comes late. The snow melts unevenly, revealing soggy ground, patches of young grass struggling to rise from the cold mud. At Callaway Ranch, the sounds of hoes, sheep calling, and the wind carrying the warmth of early spring blend together to create a slow, patient pace of life. Lillian Graves, or rather Lillian Merrick, began a new routine every morning. She opened the door before the sun, lit the stove, boiled water, and went out to the yard to dry the blankets. The simple act, shaking the damp cloth and spreading it on the clothesline, seemed to be her way of shaking off the old darkness in her heart. When the sun rose, the light filtered through the white cloth, shimmering like a breath of new life. Jonas would stand a distance away, pretending to fix the stables, but really just watching. He didn't watch out of pity, but because in her every movement he saw a quiet strength that didn't need words, but made people bow in respect. Lillian no longer spoke of the past. She talked of the harvest, of the new lamb, of yesterday's burnt pie. Each of these small, ordinary stories was to Jonas a simple miracle, because before she had been silent. But sometimes, when the sun had set and long shadows were falling across the porch, he would see her stop, as if she had heard something in the distance. Her eyes looked out at the empty fields, but her breathing was slightly disturbed. Then she would calm herself and continue her work. He did not ask, did not need to. Jonas understood. The darkness did not disappear at once. It only learned to retreat, step by step. One afternoon, when the wind blew from the south, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass, Lillian sat mending a dress on the porch. The sunlight fell on her hair, making each strand look like a thread of gold. Jonas came over and placed a small bunch of purple wildflowers on the table. "I found these near the stream," he said softly. "You can put them in the kitchen, where they will give more light." She looked up, her gaze soft and slightly confused. "I can't remember the last time anyone gave me flowers." Jonas smiled and shook his head. "No need to remember. Today is enough." She smiled, a rare smile, enough to make the sunlight seem warmer. The days passed, uneventful but not empty. Lillian began going into town every Sunday, teaching the neighborhood children to read. She said it was a way to keep her mind busy, but Jonas knew it was really a way for her to regain her faith in the world. For the first time, she laughed among the children, a clear, slightly shy, but genuine laugh. The townspeople grew accustomed to the soft-spoken, helpful, brown-haired girl. They did not know and did not care who she had been. At night, sitting on the porch, Lillian whispered, "Maybe to live like a normal person, one must accept that one was once abnormal." Jonas listened, just nodded, and to find peace, one must have known fear. They looked at each other. In that look, there was no romance, no promises, only a deep respect of two broken souls, learning to stand up together. Orimer. The next morning was clear. Lillian hung the blanket out to dry as usual. The white sheet fluttered in the wind, the sunlight reflecting off it in brilliant patches. Jonas watched from a distance, thinking that perhaps this was the cleansing they were both unconsciously seeking, not from the past, but from within. The sunlight shone on her face, softening her already thin face. No one could recognize the girl who had once run away, who had once shivered in the snow. Instead, she was a woman who lived, truly lived, with her hands and her heart. Boom. But though life had calmed down, the darkness remained, hidden deep in her dreams. One night, Jonas woke to hear her breathing heavily, calling out a name in a whisper. He did not wake her. He just sat there, watching in silence, as he had always done. In the morning, she went about her business as usual, without mentioning the dream. But Jonas noticed every time the sunlight touched her face. She took a deeper breath, as if to reassure herself that she was still here, still belonged to this world. One afternoon, as they were cleaning out the barn, Lillian said absently, "If anyone knew who I was, they probably wouldn't want to stand with me like this," Jonas replied, without raising his head. "That person has eyes but no heart. I choose to see with my heart." She was silent, but inside, something blossomed, warm, light, and hard to name. Oh. From that day on, she stopped avoiding the light. She no longer sat near the door, nor did she flinch when someone approached. While hanging the blanket, she sang softly, an old song her mother had taught her. The song drifted over the fence, dissolved in the wind, mingled with the cries of sheep and the sound of the stream, creating a song of new life. Jonas looked at that scene, his heart as calm as the surface of a lake without ripples. He understood. The most beautiful thing sometimes is not love, but when two people learn to believe in the light. And perhaps it was that belief that made Jonas gradually change the way he touched the world, from silence to gentleness, from observation to sharing. He began to learn to speak with his hands, not with words. Since that spring, Callaway Ranch has entered a new rhythm of life, slow, but full of the breath of resurrection. Grass grows green throughout the valley. Young horses grow fast. And in the small cabin on the hillside, two once silent people are now learning to live again, not through memories, but through small actions. Jonas was not a man of many words. All his life he had believed that there were things that needed to be done, not said. But with Lillian, he learned that gentleness needed to be seen, even in simple gestures. One morning, when Lillian walked into the kitchen, she found a bouquet of wildflowers on the table, lavender, purple, and white, in an old glass vase. There was no note, but she knew who had put it there. The morning light shone through the window, reflecting on the tabletop, on each dew-covered petal. She stood still, her heart beating softly in her chest, not because of the flowers, but because of the way someone had remembered her in silence. When Jonas came in, carrying the smell of grass and sunshine, she said softly, "You picked some pretty flowers." He scratched his head, his voice low and shy. "They grow near the stream. I think the kitchen could use a little more color." She smiled, a real smile, the first since arriving. Jonas saw. He didn't know why, but in that moment, he felt strangely warm inside. From then on, he began to pay more attention to the little things. When she cooked, he silently chopped wood. When she mended her clothes, he quietly oiled the door hinges, so the wind wouldn't wake her up at night. He didn't touch, didn't ask, didn't intrude. He was just there, like the steady breath of the house. One afternoon, it was raining heavily. Lillian was gathering blankets to dry when the wind blew hard, the wet cloth whipping her face. Jonas came running from the yard and covered her with his coat, both of them soaked. When they entered the kitchen, she laughed her first out-loud laugh, soft as a bell. Jonas looked at her, raindrops still rolling in his hair, and he said only one thing, "Smile. It sounds like sunshine." The words were awkward, but so true that it made her feel her throat tighten. The next day, the sky brightened. Lillian rose early again, opened the door to let in the breeze, made tea, and went out to work in the yard. Jonas remained quietly by her side, sometimes helping her carry water, sometimes fixing the roof of the barn. Thus, a language formed between them, no words, just presence. One morning she made cornbread, a food Jonas had rarely touched before. She set the plate on the table and whispered, "I heard this was your favorite when you were a kid." Jonas looked at her, surprised. "Who told you?" That she shrugged. "The grocer told me. He said your mother used to bring cornbread to the fair every fall." Jonas was silent for a moment, then nodded. He broke off a piece of bread, ate slowly, and said, "It's been a long time since I've tasted this." "Thank you." She smiled. "Nothing. I just want this kitchen to have more good memories." And from then on, every dish she cooked, every object she touched, became a piece of a new life, where two people were learning to call each other home. In the afternoons, Jonas would sit on the porch mending saddles, and she would sew dresses. As his hands touched the leather, hers the thread, they would both mend the torn things, not with words, but with patience and faith. Once, she cut her hand while chopping vegetables. The scratch was small, but the blood was bright red. Jonas rushed over, took her hand, and bandaged it with a clean cloth. He did it so gently that she had to look up. "You did it well," Jonas replied, without looking at her. "I was just afraid it would hurt you." She looked at his hand, big, rough, tanned, but the movement was as light as touching glass. And in that moment, she saw something strange. It turned out that gentleness did not come from soft hands, but from a heart that knew when to stop. In the evening, as the fire crackled, Jonas made tea. She sat opposite, reading an old newspaper clipping he had picked up in town. Outside, a gentle wind blew through the pines, carrying with it the smell of grass and wood smoke. No one spoke, but the silence was no longer oppressive, it was peaceful. Before going to bed, she stopped at the table, looked at the wilted wildflowers, and replaced them with new ones. Her hands trembled slightly, but from excitement, not fear. She wrote on a small piece of paper, leaving it next to the vase, "Thank you for staying without asking anything." The next morning, when Jonas went down to the kitchen, he found the note. He read it, said nothing, and smiled slightly. Then he folded it and put it in his pocket, a small gesture, but in it was the whole world of a man who had thought his heart had frozen forever. As the days passed, the summer light grew warmer. On the kitchen table, the wildflower bouquets changed each week, sometimes lavender, sometimes white daisies, sometimes just pampas grass. But to Lillian, they were a morning greeting, a reminder that she deserved to live gently. And for Jonas, every time he saw her smile, he knew that there were wounds that needed healing not with medicine, but with a hand patient enough not to let go. As summer came, light flooded in. Lillian began to go outside more, to the little school in town, where children ran around and called her by the name she thought she had lost forever. Summer came to Wyoming with a soft but steady light. The winter chill and spring rains had passed, leaving laughter in the air, the smell of new grass and baked goods wafting through the valley. For Lillian Graves, this was the first season in years when she felt truly alive. After her quiet days at Callaway Ranch, she began to walk out the old wooden gate. The small town of Dawson Creek, 2 miles away, no longer seemed so scary. She walked down the red dirt road into town, her wide-brimmed hat shielding her from the sun, carrying a basket of baked goods for the children in the new classroom in the old church. Before, she used to be afraid of other people's eyes. But now, when the children rushed out, laughing and calling Miss Lillian, that fear seemed to melt away in the sunshine. She bent down and took Annie's chalk-stained hand. "Teacher, I wrote the letter H today." Lillian smiled, stroking the girl's messy hair. "Good job. Annie, The letter H comes from the word hope. You know, it means hope. The girl nodded, her eyes shining, and Lillian suddenly realized she, too, was relearning to spell trust. The school was not large, just an old wooden house that had once been used as a warehouse. Light filtered through the worn curtains, creating streaks of sunlight across the desks. The children sat around the desks, their handwriting crooked, and their laughter echoed throughout the room. Lillian looked at them, her heart as light as the wind. Every time she held a child's hand and taught them how to write, she felt something healing inside her, the hand that once trembled with fear, now teaching other fingers to write the future. The Odo. Jonas would sometimes wait for her outside the school gates, sitting in a carriage, holding the farm debt book. He would watch the children run around her, their skirts flying in the wind, their laughter mingling with the birds. And in that moment he understood light comes not only from the sun, but also from someone who has dared to step out of the darkness. One day, as she was getting into the car to return home, Jonas asked quietly, "What did you teach today?" She smiled, looking out at the meadow, teaching the children to write the word kindness. One child asked why it was so long. I said, "Perhaps because kindness takes time to write correctly." Jonas smiled, a rare little smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You're right. Just like living a good life, it takes a lifetime to learn." The two were silent. The wind carried the scent of wild grass, the sound of horse hooves slowly on the red dirt road. In town, people began to get used to the image of the brown-haired teacher, a woman of few words, but with gentle eyes. Some farm owners' wives came to ask her to teach their children to read and write. Some shop owners sent eggs, butter, or milk to support the small class. Lillian did not accept them all. She only thanked them and smiled, because their love was a gift she did not expect to receive again. Occasionally, she still flinched when someone placed a hand on her shoulder, but the fear no longer lasted. Instead of backing away, she took a deep breath, then smiled, as if telling herself that the past could no longer hold her back. One afternoon, after school, the children begged her to go to the field behind the church to watch them fly kites. She agreed. The children ran like the wind, the kite strings flying high, entangling and unraveling. Their laughter echoed across the meadow, reaching as far as the foot of the mountain. She stood there, her skirt fluttering in the wind, the sunlight shining on her smiling face, a full, unhidden smile. The sight reminded her of herself as a child, a 17-year-old girl who had not yet learned that the world could be cruel. But now, looking at those children, she understood there is still room for kindness and tolerance in this world. We just have to dare to step out to see it. That evening, when Jonas led the horse to the stable, Lillian brought him a jug of water. The golden sunset bathed them both. "I see you smiling a lot today," he said softly. She nodded, putting the jug down. "Maybe I'm learning to see the light." "Jonas?" He smiled. "And I'm learning not to be afraid of losing it." They stood side by side, no words needed, in the sky. The sun set slowly behind the mountains, leaving a red glow like a half-burned fire, the light of a full day, of two people learning to believe they were worthy of peace. At night, Lillian sat on the porch, writing a few lines in a small notebook. She wrote, I used to think light was something to be searched for, but now I know. It was always there. I just didn't dare open my eyes to look." She put down her pen and looked out at the night field. The wind still blew, as light as the breath of someone who had stopped being afraid. But just as life begins to blossom, a letter from the past arrives, like a shadow returning, carrying the smell of red wax and a threat she thought she had buried. The sun was as bright as ever that day, and the wind was as gentle as if nothing in the world had changed. Only one letter, a thick, red-waxed envelope, lay quietly in the hands of the old postman in Dawson Creek. "Miss Graves," he said, his voice apologetic, "this is addressed to you, from New Orleans." Lillian stood still. The word New Orleans sent a chill through her. She took the letter, smelling the strong, waxy scent of old rooms where secrets and sins were sealed away. The red seal imprinted in the wax depicts a snake wrapped around a silver stick, a symbol of Marcus Doyle, the man she thought had died in the fire that year. Her hand trembled slightly as she held the letter. Even her breathing was ragged. She took it home and put it on the table. Jonas was hammering fence posts in the yard and, seeing her pale face, came in. "What's the matter, Lillian?" She did not reply. She just looked at the letter, her eyes glued to the red wax seal. "After a long while," she said, her voice choked, "It's him." Jonas understood at once, but said nothing. He approached slowly. When he raised his hand to touch the letter, she stopped him gently. "Don't. Let me read it first." She carefully removed the wax and unfolded the paper, trembling like a wet butterfly's wing. The handwriting was slanted, strong, and familiar. Each line was like a needle stabbing into her memory. "Lillian, I know where you are. Wyoming, Callaway Ranch. You think you can escape. No one escapes me. You are mine still in property. Send $200 to my old address by October, or I will come and collect it. Marcus Doyle." At the end of the letter, the red wax seal was printed again, roughly, like a blood mark that never fades. Lillian dropped the paper. Her hand slipped from the desk, hitting the cold wood. She felt her breath hitch, as if she were falling into a bottomless pit. All the light she had learned to embrace was now swallowed up. Jonas picked up the paper and read it silently. When he looked up, there was no anger in his eyes, only a quiet pain. What does he want, money? Or me? Both are the same to him. She turned away, not wanting him to see her tears. But Jonas stepped forward and took her by the shoulders. "He won't touch you. Not again." She shook her head, her voice breaking. "You don't understand. Jonas, men like him, they don't just take bodies. They take souls. I thought I was safe. But he's still alive, and he knows where I am." She sank into a chair, her head in her hands. The afternoon light filtered through the window, illuminating the red seal still on the table, a stain of blood in the seemingly peaceful room. That night, the wind blew hard. The windows rattled. Lillian could not sleep. Every little noise startled her. In the darkness, she heard the sound of horse chains clanking outside the stable, as if someone were approaching. Jonas was still awake. He sat in the living room, his shotgun beside him. The fire in the fireplace was dying down, but the dim light was enough to illuminate the letter lying on the table. He looked at the red wax seal, his eyes dark. He understood that her past was more than just a thing of the past. It was a beast that knew how to find its way back. And now, It was knocking at the door. The next morning, Lillian did not teach. She sat by the window, looking out at the yellow fields. Her face was pale from lack of sleep. Jonas brought coffee and placed it gently on the table. "You don't have to teach today," he said. "I'll go into town and tell the sheriff." "No," she interrupted. "If they knew, I'd be the object of pitying glances again. They'd see me not as a teacher, but as someone who was dirty." Jonas's hand tightened at that, but he did not object. He only said softly, "Then we will keep quiet. But I promise, if he comes here, I will stand between him and you." She looked at him, her eyes still filled with worry. But something warmed. "You don't have to do that. This is my business." Jonas shook his head. "No. Since you entered this house, it has been my business too." Achutihi. Evening fell. The sky was a deep copper color. She went out into the yard and stood looking at the horizon. Somewhere, in the distance, he must really be on his way. Every cold wind that blew by reminded her of those nights when the wind blew like that through the window and she was locked in a room with no exit. She clenched her hands, her nails digging into her skin, trying to stop the shaking. But the tears still fell, silently, without a sound. Inside the house, Jonas stood silently watching from a distance. He did not run to her, did not comfort her, only gave her space. He understood that there were fears that could not be extinguished. They could only be shared. That night, she wrote back, not to send it, but to say what she had never said out loud. "Marcus Doyle, I was yours, because I had no choice. But now, I am. I owe you nothing. If you come, I will not hide. But this time, I will not stand alone." She folded the letter and threw it into the fire. The paper burned slowly, the flames reflecting off her face. Tears and determination mingled. Jonas stepped in, standing behind her, not asking what she had done. He just watched the fire flare up, then put his hand on her shoulder. No words needed, just a gesture, but enough to let her know she was no longer being hunted alone. 2 weeks later, as the silhouette of a man on horseback appeared on the horizon, Lillian stood up from her porch, no longer hiding, but ready to face the nightmare that was Marcus Doyle. That morning, the fog was so thick that it obscured the trail leading into Dawson Creek. The sound of horses' hooves faded away, echoing through the mist like the beat of an approaching sentence. Jonas gripped the reins tightly, his face cold and determined. In his pocket was the letter with the red wax seal, now evidence of a crime the land no longer accepted. He knew Lillian could not live in his shadow forever. "Must bring it to light," he said to himself as he pulled his horse to a stop in front of the town hall. Inside, a few people were present. Sheriff McAllister, the grocer, Reverend Harris, and farmers from surrounding farms. The rumor spread quickly. The old trafficker sent a letter to Miss Lillian. Jonas placed the letter on the wooden table, his voice hoarse but firm. "His name is Marcus Doyle. He kidnapped and held her captive. Now he is sending blackmail letters." The sheriff frowned, lifted the envelope, and looked at the red seal, which was still cracked. He lowered his voice. "We won't let him touch a hair on her head." An elderly woman spoke up. "Miss Lillian taught my son to read. She belongs here. If that guy dares to come, he will have to go over all of us." The words brought a hush to the room, followed by a chorus of nods of agreement. Jonas stood still, his hands clenched for the first time. He saw this small community not as a shelter, but as a living wall. That afternoon, Marcus Doyle really showed up. From the west, a black horse tore through the dusty trail. He was just as Lillian remembered him, tall, broad-shouldered, with the pale smile of someone who believes everything belongs to him. His long cloak swept the dust. His low hat half covered his face, but those gray eyes were unmistakable. When his horse stopped in the middle of the square, he looked up and saw Lillian Graves standing on the steps of the town hall, the autumn wind lightly tossing her brown hair. Years passed. She was no longer the scared girl. No longer had her eyes downcast. Now, before him stood a woman standing tall, with a calm smile like someone who had just survived a storm and had nothing left to lose. Marcus dismounted and walked over, his voice hoarse. "Long time no see. Lillian. I came to take back what is mine." No one in the square said anything. There was only the sound of the wind and the slight swaying of the bells hanging from the church roof. Jonas stepped out from the line, blocking the way between them. "She doesn't belong to me. No one belongs to me." Doyle laughed, a dry laugh. "She was mine. I bought her. She owed me." Lillian interrupted him, her voice clear. "Word by word, I owe you nothing. You cannot buy back a soul you have destroyed." He turned to look at her, his smile fading. "You think they'll protect you. A prostitute who was sold in New Orleans." The air froze. A few of the women gasped, but Lillian did not bow her head. She took another step, letting the afternoon light fall directly on her face, and in that moment, the camera seemed to revolve around her, the center of light. In the crowd, the autumn wind swirled around her pale gray dress. Her voice rang out, not trembling, not weak. "You don't own me. Not anymore." Silence fell, heavy and deep. Marcus stood still for a few seconds, then pulled back his sleeve, reaching for his belt. But there was a dry click of a cocking pistol. Jonas had drawn his gun. The black barrel pointed at him. Sheriff McAllister did the same. "Put your hands down. Doyle, you're standing in the middle of a town that's no longer afraid." Doyle looked around, meeting the determined eyes of everyone, farmers, housewives, ministers, even children crouched in windows, watching. No one backed away. He sneered, taking a step back, then two. "You will regret covering it up." Jonas took another half step. "No, we pride ourselves on choosing the right people to stand on our side." Doyle looked at Lillian one last time. A look that was a mixture of anger and suspicion, then turned his horse and galloped away, leaving a cloud of red dust rising like the smoke of a dying nightmare. When he was gone, the crowd stood still. No one spoke. Only when a breeze blew, ruffling Lillian's hair, did someone begin to clap. Then another. Then the whole square joined, in a murmur of applause, like waves washing away an old stain. Jonas looked at her, his eyes shining with something between pride and emotion. He said softly, so that only she could hear, "He didn't get your soul. You got it back." Lillian turned, her lips slightly curved, her smile trembling. "No, Jonas. It was you and everyone else who gave it to me." She looked around. Familiar faces, neighbors, students, friends, all stood with her in this light. For the first time in her life, Lillian Graves was no longer afraid of anyone's gaze. As the sun set, the last golden light of the day fell on the town. covering her face like a halo. She stood there, silent, the wind gently blowing her skirts, the light shining on her eyes that had cleared of mist. The camera slowly pans back, capturing her in the middle of the sun-drenched square, a woman who was once a victim, now standing firm in the very place that once made her tremble. No more darkness, no more chains, only the light of freedom and dignity. When Doyle left, autumn was beginning to turn the valley golden. Life was returning, but something in everyone's heart had changed, like after a storm. The ground is softer, and people's hearts are kinder. But sometimes, the storm doesn't really end right after it passes. It leaves echoes, faint streaks of thunder in the sky of memory. 3 days after the confrontation in the square, Marcus Doyle was captured less than 10 miles from town. Sheriff McAllister and several townspeople found him shivering, dirty, and hungry in an abandoned shack. When he was brought back handcuffed, he was no longer the arrogant human trafficker he had once been, twisted shadow of himself, pursued by the very nightmare he had created. The news of his capture spread through the land like a gentle breeze. No one cheered. No one gloated. They were silent, for there are victories that need no noise, just a breath of peace. As Doyle's carriage passed through the square, Lillian Graves stood by the window of the cottage, watching him. He turned his head once. His ashen eyes, which had kept her awake for years, were now empty. She was not afraid, nor did she hate him. She just watched him pass like a dead winter. The first wind of the season brought the smell of rain. She gently closed the door, but in her heart, another door had just opened, the door of true freedom. That afternoon, a light rain began to fall. The first drops of rain fell on the eaves, breaking into a heartbeat. Jonas came in from the stable, his coat wet, his face sunburned, but his eyes kind. He stopped on the porch and saw Lillian standing there, her hand on the doorframe, her eyes looking out into the rain. The rain covered her hair, making dark brown strands stick to her cheeks, and she looked both fragile and peaceful, as if the rain was washing away the last of her pain. He walked over and gently covered her shoulders with his warm coat. "It's cold in the rain." She nodded, her voice as soft as a breath. "But I don't feel cold. For the first time, Jonas, I can breathe easily." He looked at her for a long time. "It is the breath of freedom, Lillian." She smiled slightly, a rare smile, not because of joy, but because she finally understood freedom is not running away from the past, but daring to look it straight in the eye and still moving forward. She stepped out onto the porch, umbrella-less, letting the rain fall on her face. Each cold drop felt like a forgiveness against her skin. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, letting the wind and rain blend together. The sensation was so light it made her heart tremble. Jonas looked at her, and a quiet emotion welled up in his heart. He had never seen her so beautiful, not the beauty of jewels or dress, but the beauty of a soul newly returned to itself. Dodastiv. Suddenly, her legs gave way. Jonas ran to catch her. "Lillian, I'm fine," she said softly, breathing heavily. "It's just so light, as if my body had forgotten how to carry the weight of fear." He held her in his arms, the rain still pattering on their shoulders. No one said anything more. At that moment, the world was just the breath of two people who had gone through the abyss, and now sat together, silently living. She rested her head on his chest. His heartbeat was steady like a horse's rhythm in the field. For the first time since leaving New Orleans, she felt a shoulder she could trust. He did not say any words of comfort, nor did he make any promises. He only kept her in silence, the silence of people who understand each other without needing words. That night, the rain continued. In the dim light of the fire, Lillian woke to find Jonas sitting by the fire. He was still awake, holding an old Bible in his hand. She asked hoarsely, "What are you reading?" He replied, "This verse. The truth shall set you free. I think it's about you." She was silent for a moment, then smiled softly. "If it is true, then it is indeed the longest road I have ever traveled." Jonas looked at her, his voice low but firm. "But you've come all the way." Outside, the rain was gradually fading. The scent of damp earth seeped through the window, fresh and gentle. She got out of bed and moved closer to him. The firelight illuminated her face. The traces of her tears had dried. She said softly, as if talking to herself tomorrow, "I want to go to the fields. I want to plant flowers again in the same place, where I burned them all when I first came here." He nodded. "They will grow back, just like you." She smiled, tears of happiness this time. She turned to look outside, where the rain had faded. Only a thin mist covered the valley, like a breath of freedom, cool, peaceful, and alive. The next morning, as the sun peeked over the wet grass, Lillian stepped out into the yard. There was no longer any fear, only a void filled with peace. The wind carried the scent of last night's rain, the scent of a new beginning. She knelt down, her hands touching the ground, digging small holes, placing each flower seed in the ground as if to send back to nature her thanks. Jonas stood at a distance, watching her, then bent down to help. No one spoke, but their every movement turning the soil, burying the seeds, covering them back like a ritual of resurrection. As they stood up, the wind blew, carrying with it the scent of new earth. Lillian took a deep breath, then said softly, "Perhaps this is the first time in my life that I am not afraid of tomorrow." Jonas smiled, his eyes sparkling in the morning light. "Then let us say hello to it, one day at a time." The next morning, Dawson Creek seemed to be dressed in a new coat. In the small chapel, bells rang softly to announce the wedding. No extravagance, no gold rings, just a blue ribbon tying the hands of the two people together. A simple but sincere beginning. That morning, the early winter sunlight shone through a thin layer of mist, forming sparkling streaks of light on the dirt road leading to St. Agnes Chapel. It was a small chapel, located on a low hill south of town. The white walls had faded, but the stained glass windows still reflected light like pieces of rainbow scattered on old wood. In the valley, the horses tied in front of the porch were silent, as if they understood that today was not a working day, but a day for gentle things. Inside, Jonas Merrick waited, his old suit pressed, his light brown coat so clean it was almost unfamiliar to him. His hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from something deeper, a quiet emotion. At the back of the sanctuary, Lillian Graves entered. She wore a cream linen dress, no lace, no white chiffon, just a pale blue ribbon tied loosely around her wrist, the color of peace, and also the color of the sky she had been afraid to look directly at. As she moved forward, each of her footsteps echoed on the old wooden floor. Each sound, like the heartbeat of a land just through a long winter. Reverend Harris, old but gentle, waited at the altar. He smiled at them, not the polite smile of ceremony, but the smile of someone who had suffered enough to know that just one person choosing to stay with another was a miracle. He said, his voice hoarse, slow, but warm like a fire in the snow, "We don't need rings. We don't need flowers. We just need trust. Because what connects two people is not gold, but what they have overcome together." Jonas nodded slightly. He turned to look at Lillian. In her brown eyes, he saw himself reflected, not the lonely man, but someone who was trusted, who was seen. The priest took a thin and soft blue ribbon from the table. The light shining through it made it look like flowing water. He tied their hands together, so light that it was almost invisible, but enough to make them feel the bond that was unbound and inseparable. He read the blessing. May these hands always find each other, in the dark as well as in the golden sunshine, in silence as well as in words, in loss as well as in finding. As he spoke, light streamed through the glass windows, bathing their faces in a brilliant array of colors, blue, red and yellow if nature were sending its blessings through sunlight. Lillian looked at Jonas, her lips moving slightly. "I never thought I would be standing here, in the light, in front of everyone." Jonas squeezed her hand gently and replied in a low voice, just loud enough for her to hear, "And I never thought my heart could be as peaceful as it is now." She laughed, a real laugh, not forced, not afraid, as if she had just left a lifetime of darkness behind. The pastor nodded and said softly, "You can start over here." As the little bells rang from the chapel tower, the sound carried far across the valley, mingling with the wind. Everyone on the porch, the grocer, the sheriff, the school children, the farmers who had silently supported them in the previous confrontation, all smiled. There were no flowers, no wine, just cornbread, honey, and the smell of hot coffee from an old pot. An old woman handed Lillian a small bouquet of wildflowers, roadside flowers, but as beautiful as a field to her. She turned to Jonas and whispered, "Do you remember the first time I arranged flowers on the table?" You couldn't look straight at me. He smiled softly. Now I can look, forever. Outside, the clouds were clearing, the sky clear as if washed clean by last night's rain. They walked out together, their hands still tied with the blue ribbon. The wind gently lifted the silk ribbon, making it flutter, soft as a strip of light. She looked at it, her voice trembling slightly. "I want to keep it forever, not because it binds us, but because it reminds me. Freedom and attachment can coexist." Jonas tilted his head slightly, his eyes as soft as an afternoon after the wind. That's what true love is. They walked down the steps together, where the ground was still wet with dew, and the light fell on them, casting long shadows on the ground, a simple yet eternal image. In the evening, when the guests had all gone, they were left alone in the chapel. The scent of pine resin from the candles mingled with the last light of the day. Lillian sat in the pew, touching the blue ribbon still on her wrist, and said softly, "I don't know what the future holds, Jonas, but I know I'm not afraid any more." He sat down next to her and softly replied, "We will go through everything, just like we got here, small steps, but always together." The camera slowly pulled back. Through the chapel's glass window, the afternoon light shone through, creating a thin golden streak, illuminating the pair of hands holding each other. The chapel bell rang once more, as light as a breath of hope. Outside, the fields were beginning to turn honey-colored. The wind blew, and the blue ribbons fluttered, like a silent prayer for the broken hearts that now beat for love again. Winter passed, and as the snow melted, the seeds Lillian had planted began to sprout. She wrote in her diary, "Love does not come like magic, but like spring, slow, gentle, and sure." A year had passed since they had tied their hands with blue ribbons in the little chapel. Dawson Creek was different now. No longer a town of reserved people, but a place where children laughed every morning, where someone still sent baked goods through the window because it was such a beautiful day. In a cabin on the hillside, Lillian Merrick sat at a small wooden table, in front of a window that opened onto a sun-drenched garden. Her hand rested on her belly, where a small life was stirring, a reminder that all beginnings take time to blossom. Outside, Jonas was fixing a new fence. He looked up occasionally and caught her eye through the window. They didn't speak, just smiled, the kind of communication people used to living with their hearts rather than their words. Juan, Hanim. On the table was a leather-bound diary, where she wrote each line in her soft handwriting, March 12th. Spring has come. The seeds I planted last year have sprouted. I think perhaps God has heard my prayer not for happiness, but for the courage to receive happiness when it comes. She raised her head and looked outside. The flower garden in front of the porch was ablaze white chrysanthemums, purple lavender, and yellow aster clumps of chrysanthemums jostling under the sun, swaying in the warm breeze. In the middle of the garden, the little willow tree Jonas had planted last year was sprouting new leaves. Each leaf was like a green letter from spring, announcing everything is coming back to life, including you. That afternoon, as the wind blew from the meadows, Lillian put on her woolen shawl and went outside. She walked slowly, her hand gently rubbing her belly. Beneath her feet, the earth was soft and smelled of moisture, the smell of life. Jonas looked up when he saw her approaching. He put down his hammer and walked over, his voice warm and light as the wind. "You shouldn't stay out too long. It's still cold." She smiled, her hand still touching her belly. "I like to listen to the sound of the wind. Every time the wind blows, I kick." He looked at her, his eyes shining with unspeakable joy. He bent down, placed his hand on her belly, felt the life, small but strong. "Maybe the baby loves the meadow as much as you do." She nodded slightly, her eyes looking far away. "I used to be afraid of the sound of the wind, Jonas. It reminded me of the sound of doors closing, the sound of horses pulling. But now, the wind is only the breath of freedom." As the evening sun fell, they sat on the porch steps, watching the sun set behind the hills. The last rays of light dyed the fields a golden color, turning everything into a picture of warmth that choked them. Jonas put his arm around her shoulders and said softly, "I remember the first time you came here. You didn't dare look anyone in the eye." She laughed softly, her gaze soft, and I didn't dare say a word. "It's different now. Yes, now. We've learned to be silent together, but a peaceful silence." Night fell. In the cabin, the oil lamp burned low. Lillian opened her diary again and wrote a few more lines. March 17th. I hear my baby's heartbeat when I put my ear to my chest. Maybe it's the first song of this spring. She looked up and saw Jonas sleeping on the chair, still holding the old Bible in his hand. The fire in the fireplace crackled softly, casting a warm light on his face. She smiled, closed the book, put her hand on her stomach, and whispered, "My child, your father is a man of few words, but everything he does is a declaration of love." The next morning, a light mist hung over the meadow, like a silver silken veil. Lillian opened the door and took a deep breath. The spring air carried the scent of damp pine and early lavender. She walked down the steps, walking slowly towards the garden. The camera panned from her round belly to the colorful flower garden, where bees began to buzz and white butterflies fluttered around yellow heather. She sat down, her hand touching each petal, gently stroking as if touching dormant memories. You have come back to life. After all, Jonas came over, carrying a basket of new seeds. I think we should plant some blue daisies this year, to match the ribbon you're wearing. She looked up and smiled. The color of freedom and new beginnings. I like that. The sunlight slanted in, making her hair pale copper color. Jonas knelt beside her, helping her plant each seed in the ground. Each seed was covered with a pinch of soft soil, as light as a kiss. I never thought I would get to do this, she said, her voice as soft as a breath. I never thought I would be pure enough to sow a new life. He paused, looked at her, and then said in a calm, sincere voice, "None of us are truly pure, Lillian. It's just that you choose to be better every day, and that makes you worthy of all the miracles." She turned around, her eyes glistening with tears, but not sad tears. Miracles do happen. That afternoon, the wind carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh earth. She stood in the middle of the garden, the wind blowing her skirt and hair lightly, her arms hugging her stomach, her mouth smiling. The camera stopped there. The golden light shone through, creating an image of her and the garden as one, person and land, memory and present, pain and life. A distant bell tolled from St. Agnes Chapel, echoing through the valley like a final benediction. Years later, when people told the children of Lillian Merrick, the woman who sowed flowers in the wind, they didn't talk about her pain. They just said that because of her, all Dawson Creek learned to believe in spring. 10 years had passed since that spring came to Dawson Creek. Now, when the wind blew across the fields, one no longer saw barren land, but instead saw stretches of flowers stretching to the horizon. The seeds Lillian had sown with trembling hands, now blossoming into a season of bloom. Jonas and Lillian Merrick's cabin sat high on a hill overlooking a golden valley. That afternoon, the sun slowly set, casting a warm glow across the wooden porch. Jonas stood in the doorway, a cup of hot tea in his hand, his eyes fixed on the front porch, where Lillian and her little daughter Grace sat among the lavender pots. Grace was about 8, her soft brown hair falling across her forehead, her face a mixture of her mother's peaceful expression and her father's steady gaze. She was laughing, a silvery bell-like laugh, as she tried to tie blue ribbons around the bouquet her mother had picked. Lillian looked up at her son, then at Jonas. They smiled a wordless smile, of two people who had been through the darkness and now lived in their own light. The wind blew up from the valley, caressing the green ribbons, making them flutter in the afternoon light. That green, the color of freedom, of new beginnings, of faith, was still there, 10 years later, as if it had never faded. Jonas came down the steps and approached them. "Do you know how much gardening you do? This whole valley is about to turn into a sea of flowers." Lillian laughed, the sunlight hitting her cheeks. "And you say that like it's a bad thing." He shrugged slightly. "No, I think, if there must be something for people to remember this place, I want it to be flowers, not winter." Grace laughed loudly, holding the bouquet up to her father. "Look, Dad, I tied it tight like Mom taught me." Jonas bent down, carefully adjusted the knot, and whispered, just like Mom, delicate and strong. Lillian looked at them, an indescribable warmth rising in her heart. Everything now seemed small and simple, but it was in that peace that she found the deepest meaning of life. "Metwin Ruvain." As the twilight lengthened, the three of them sat together on the porch steps. The smell of old wood mingled with the scent of flowers, and crickets chirped from the distant meadows. No one spoke. The world seemed to stand still for a moment. Lillian leaned her head on Jonas's shoulder, her eyes looking out at the red horizon. She whispered, "Do you remember the first days I came here? The wind blew so hard I thought I would be blown away forever." Jonas nodded slightly, his voice low and warm. "I remember. But then you stayed, and it was you who made the wind calm down." She smiled softly, her hand squeezing his gently. "Maybe the wind is not fierce. It's just that when we stop being afraid of it, we can hear the whisper of freedom." Grace ran to sit on her mother's lap, looked up and asked Mommy, "Why do you always talk to the wind?" Lillian stroked her head and softly replied, "Because the wind carries memories. My child, it remembers all the things people forget." Jonas placed his hands on the shoulders of mother and child, his eyes filled with thought, no longer heavy as before, but the silence of someone who understands that every wound is a reminder of the power to survive. As the sunset touched the hills, Jonas looked around the house. The roof was faded, the fence worn with time, but everything here was breathing, living, loving. He looked at his wife and daughter, then spoke softly, his voice like a whisper to himself. To the land that had witnessed so many ups and downs, survival was just the beginning. Now, we're truly alive. Nenkos, man. Lillian turned to him. In the last light of day, her eyes reflected a brilliant gold, the light of someone who had found peace. She spoke softly, almost in the wind. "I used to think I didn't deserve to live fully. But maybe, because we've lost, we can be grateful for every moment we have left." Jonas smiled. He reached out, removed a small petal from her hair, and placed it in his daughter's palm. Grace looked up, her voice clear. "I will plant it, Mother, so when I grow up, I can say that my parents taught me how to make flowers bloom in once barren land." Lillian smiled through her tears, nodding slightly. "Do so, Grace, because each flower is a thank you for life." The camera slowly moves away, past the wooden porch, across the flower-filled fields. The sunset bathes the valley, where the wind blows blue ribbons fluttering in the afternoon. A rustic soundtrack begins. Guitar and violin blend together, slow, warm, fading into the color of the sky. The small house became tiny in the vast space, but the scene was not sad, only the silence of souls at peace, of people who found reasons to live, to love, to believe. As the sun set, their shadows merged on the wooden steps. A small family, a big story. And in that borderland, the wind still blew, carrying the scent of flowers, carrying the memories of people who had learned to live each day to the fullest. The story of Jonas and Lillian Merrick is not just one of tragedy healed, but a song of kindness and forgiveness. It reminds us that sometimes the quietest people carry the fiercest battles. And it only takes one person patient enough, gentle enough, to learn to believe in the light again. Love doesn't always come in a bright light. It can come in a cup of hot tea, a hand that doesn't ask why, or a look that says you're safe. Just as Lillian found freedom in facing her darkness, each of us can learn to love ourselves even when we've been deeply wounded. In a world full of noise, this story is a reminder that kindness, no matter how small, can save a soul. If you are watching this video, perhaps your heart believes it too, that people can still be gentle with each other, even in the midst of devastation. Thank you for taking the time to accompany Frontier Hearts. If you believe in the power of kindness and stories that make us cry in silence, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to tell stories that warm your heart, like a small fire in the windy season of the frontier.